Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet and you are watching a new episode on the Wojennik TV YouTube channel. Today I would like to present you a game which traveled from far abroad. This is a game which was sent by the Australian company Chris Harding Simulations, and the game is called Operation Compass. So this will be a game which will enable us to recreate one of the most successful offensives during World War II. It was an offensive launched by the British in December 1940 against the Italian forces in northern Africa. The operation was such a huge success that it exceeded all the initial expectations. The front line was pushed to the west hundreds of kilometers and more than 130,000 Italian prisoners of war were taken. So it is really hard to find another operation during the same period of the war which was such a spectacular success, because the British really achieved all this with minor losses. Now the game is a game for solitaire play, so it is a design which will enable only one player to participate. We will be taking control of the British forces and we will try to recreate the successes which the British achieved historically in 1940 and 1941. The time of play is extremely pleasant because the game should be finished in about 2 hours. The designer of this game is Chris Harding himself, the owner of the company Chris Harding Simulations. Now this is not a very young company, because Chris Harding launched his business back in 2006 and he already published several games. Up until now, those games were games for 2 or even more players, but the company lacked a product for 1 player for solitaire play, and Operation Compass is something which will fill this gap. Now, is it a good design? Is it an enjoyable game? I will try to give you the answers to those questions during this review. So first of all, let's take a look at the components which will be used during gameplay. Then I will explain how the game works, and at the end of this review I will give you my final thoughts. Let's go! Here is Operation Compass in all its glory. Now first let's take a look at all the elements which will be used during gameplay. The first and major element is the game map. The game map, as you can see, represents the terrain on which the original operation took place. It's a paper map, not of a big size, but representing all the terrain on which this offensive took place. So the starting point of the British forces from where the offensive will be launched is somewhere on the eastern part of the map, in the areas of Bir el-Abbas, Absas, and in the areas east of Sidi Barani. The second side of the map shows the areas of Sollum, and this will be the major British objective, because our goal will be to reach the western side of the map, at the same time by eliminating the most possible number of Italian units. This map shows some terrain features such as clear terrain, such as ridges, wadi escarpments, hills, towns, coasts, major roads and some minor roads, which are also called trails in the terrain effects table. Now this is not a very complicated map, but it's a very functional map. I like the fact that we absolutely have no doubt what are the main terrain features on each hex. It's not a complicated map, but at the same time it offers a lot of decisions, because each time during your turn you will have to carefully plan which path to take. The structure of the terrain effects table is such that you will always have to carefully plan which path to take, how to use your movement points, but I will talk about it a little bit later. The second element which we receive in this game are, of course, the counters, and we receive a few types of those counters. The first one will be the battle units, the battle counters, and there will be two types of them. The first ones will be the Italian units used to indicate the forces of our artificial intelligence opponent. Now those counters, as you can see, are counters representing Italian formations, and those units, those counters will have three information on them. First of all, we'll have their strength, but this will be only the partial strength, their final strength if attacked, then their morale, and finally also their rating. Now this rating is important because it can vary from A, B to C, and it will indicate their global strength. As I said earlier, the first number is only the basic strength. This can and will be increased by additional counters drawn randomly from a pool. Those counters are double-sided, but the second side doesn't represent a new level. It represents the starting hex. So in order to prepare the game, you can both use the rules where we have the description of each unit and their starting location, but you can also just turn around the counters and look for the information about the starting hex. A good sign, a good info is that I have found absolutely no typo, both in the rulebook and on the counters. You can just use them without being afraid that there is a mistake somewhere on the counters. The second type of counters are the ones that we will be using during the offensive, and the British forces will be composed of different units. The first one will be the headquarters. We receive three such units, and those will be our headquarters, our leaders, our commanding units. Those will be used in order to get aerial support and also to bombard Italian units before the real combat begins. Those units have three factors, three information. The first one in the brackets is the range, the second one is the bombardment strength, and the third one is the movement allowance. The second type of unit used will be a standard combat unit. We can have both motorized infantry or tanks or armored cars. The armor units will have an additional information in the middle. This one will be the support factor. Infantry units or motorized infantry do not have this additional parameter. The first number is the assault strength. The last one, as in the case of the HQs, is the mobility factor. The last information in the middle is the morale, because morale will be playing a huge role in this title. Those units are not double-sided because British units, our own units, will be taking step losses by receiving additional counters. The third type of allied counter used will be the supply columns, because during gameplay we will have to track supply. We will have to bring supply to our units in order to enable them fighting with their full potential. It's also crucial to bring supply in order to achieve victory conditions. Now we have a set of additional counters which will be used. Those will be track counters, it will be information markers, and we will be needing also three cups to store those counters. The first one will be used to stack the Italian defense strength markers. Those markers will be randomly drawn during the game, and two additional cups which will be used for ground support counters, because we will be able to receive ground support, but sometimes the Italians will receive their own ground support also. So those two so those two caps will be used. Apart from this, we receive additional information markers. So we receive step markers, out of supply markers, retreat, abandoned counters, which will be used during gameplay to track different things. Now, there is no die added to the game, but you should use at least 2 of them during gameplay, not a big issue for any wargamer. The final component of Operation Compass is the rulebook. The rulebook is a black and white rulebook, very well written, a relatively short one, but as I said, well written, with a nice composition, with a nice structure. What I really like is the fact that we receive also a designer notes section in which we can read about the rationale, about the idea that the designer had while preparing this game, some additional bibliography for the ones interested by this operation and by additional reading. At the end also the rules governing setup and how to determine victory, and finally information about all the tables used during gameplay. So for instance, the CRT table or the morale table, the morale check die roll modifiers, and the terrain effects table, all you need to play. Now let's pass on to a short description of the mechanisms of this game, of the game objective, and of how the game works. The objective of Operation Compass is accomplishing a complete victory by defeating the Italian defense forces and taking control of hex 0102. So we have to travel through the entire map in order to smash through the Italian defense line and take this road, which is a crucial road which will enable us to continue our offensive to the west. Now, this is not an easy task because while going west, we will encounter Italian defense lines and we will have to cope with those defense lines by surrounding them or smashing through them. The points at the end will be calculated in accordance to the number of Italian units eliminated. Each such a unit will be worth a certain number of victory points. The special Maletti group will be worth 4 victory points. All other Italian regiments will be worth 3 victory points, and each Italian battalion will be worth 1 victory point. But destroying the Italian units is not everything. You also have to minimize your own losses, because each Allied headquarters eliminated will be worth 10 victory points for your virtual opponent, whereas each Allied combat unit eliminated will be a 5-point deduction. So you will have to, first of all, break through the Italian line, reach the destination hex, destroy the biggest number of Italian units possible, and minimize your own losses. So not a very easy task. In the end, we calculate the victory points and we verify how well our offensive went. We have to gather 39 victory points or more in order to score a major victory, which was the historical outcome. Now, a game of Operation Compass lasts for 7 turns, and after the 7th turn we calculate those points. Now, how a turn of Operation Compass looks like. The first phase played during a turn is the Allied supply phase, which is verified, which is played from turn 2 onwards. During this phase, we verify if our units are in supply. In order to see this, we have to make sure that those units can trace a supply to our supply columns, and that those supply columns can trace supply to the eastern side of the map. So we have to carefully advance with not only our units, but also with our supply columns. Those supply columns will use movement points in order to verify if they can reach the road and then the eastern boundary of the map. A unit which is out of supply is marked with a special marker, and it has its assault strength halved. Furthermore, this will influence the mobility, because units marked with an out of supply marker cannot provide support and have the movement allowance halved as well. So it is crucial to maintain your units in supply and to make sure that while moving you keep a line of supply to your supply lines. The second phase during a turn will be the allied movement phase, and during this phase we will be able to move our units using the movement allowance and in accordance to the terrain effects chart. Each unit has a certain number of movement points. It is possible to move those units individually or in stacks, because we can stack units up to 4 units at one hex. Any 4 battalions, additionally 1 headquarter unit and 1 supply column can be stacked on a hex. This is important because in this game stacking will also influence combat, which I will explain in a few moments. Now, movement is pretty much easy because it's just like in other games. You verify the number of movement points, you see how a terrain is described in the terrain effect chart, and you move your unit. The following phase is the allied combat phase, and this is the fun part of the game because during this phase you will resolve all the attacks. The attacks are being resolved first of all by conducting bombardments. Each headquarter can conduct a bombardment using its bombardment statistics and a special bombardment resolution table. Bombarding opposing units can reduce those units, but it cannot eliminate them. Additionally, each such a unit can bombard units only at a certain distance. After such initial bombardments, we can resolve attacks between units placed on bordering hexes. Now, I said that stacking influences combat. It does influence combat in the way that you can only attack from one and only one hex. There is no multiple hexes battles in this game, so it will always be a one hex onto one hex battle. Units surrounding the attacked unit can give support and they can give additional benefits to an attack, but their strength is not added to the attacking unit's total. Now, attacking means, first of all, determining which defending hex will be assaulted. We nominate always the lead unit among those which will participate in the combat. So this will be a unit which will take the losses in the first priority in case of a bad result. Secondly, we will also determine the hex which we are being attacking. Secondly, we total the defense strength of all defending units in the hex. So as I said, it's one hex against one hex. If there are multiple Italian units on a hex, we make the sum of such units' strength. What I said earlier is also that those Italian units have several steps. Now, when you move next to an Italian unit, you will draw a counter from a cheat pool and you will verify the strength of such a unit. Such a strength can be different if we see the morale or the quality of a unit, because each time we will verify the morale of such a unit, or rather not the morale but the quality of such a unit, which can vary from A to C. When we draw a cheat, we always see which letter this unit has, and we take the strength from the drawn counter in accordance to the same letter. So this unit, the 63 infantry Italian unit, will have a strength of 6 plus 4, which will be a 10. That's a nice idea because each time the strength of such a unit can be different. It all depends on the counter drawn. A unit taking losses will have first of all its counter reduced, and then it will have its counter removed. This will be the last step of such a defending unit. If it receives again a result which will require a step loss, it will be eliminated and it will give some points at the game's end to the opposing side. Now, returning to the combat sequence, we make the defense strength total and we compare it to the total assault strength. After doing so, we verify the column in which this result is located, and then we make a two dice roll. We roll the dice and we also use some additional modifiers which can modify the result. Those modifiers can be related to terrain, to Italian ground support or to Allied ground support. Some additional ones are used when attacking retreating units, or if we have armor support. The ground support is being given to attacking units if headquarters are taking part in such an offensive. While doing so, we make a die roll in a dedicated table, and the result can be an aerial support of such an attack, which will furthermore influence the final result of our die rolls. It is also possible that the Italians will receive ground support, and if this is the case, we will also use additional modifiers. Now, the results of such a battle may require us to make morale checks, and those morale checks will be made also by making die rolls with some additional modifiers. A failed morale check will most often require us to reduce a unit, so this unit will take some step losses. Those morale checks are pretty tricky because some units have high morale, others can have lesser morale. It's much easier to reduce a morale of Italian weaker units, but some of them are pretty hard to reduce. Our own units also can be reduced, and the first step loss is always taken by the lead unit. After all the retreats, after all the combats which are resolved in the order that we want, we pass on to the next phase, which is the Italian retreat phase. Now, this phase is played from turn 3 onwards, and during this phase we make some additional die rolls in order to verify if the opposing Italian units start a retreat. Now, this retreat is done in two directions. Some units retreat in the direction of Solom and others in the direction of Sidi Barani. Now, the probability of such a retreat increases if those Italian units are close to some Allied units, if they have taken some hits, if they received step losses, and of course such a retreat will cause such units to move in the direction of one of those two locations. So the Italians will start to move in the direction of those two spots, and this also means that they will sometimes leave their fortified areas, and they will also block routes which can take us in the speediest way to the target hex. So it's a good thing and at the same time a bad thing, because many Italian units will just make some clutter on the roads, and those roads, those paths are not very dense in the western part of the map. We will have to pass through such Italian defenses. At the end of this phase, we pass on to the administration phase, during which we make a cleanup consisting of adding the used ground support counters inside the pools, and also moving the game turn marker one box forward. And that's pretty it when it comes to the basic rules of Operation Compass and of the description of how a game turn works. There are some other rules governing, for instance, cut-off units, armor support or supporting units. Some additional rules are also describing surprise attacks during turn 1, etc. But I won't be describing them right now. Rather than that, I would like to pass on to a conclusion and to tell you what I think about this title, what are my opinions and what are my final thoughts about Operation Compass. When thinking of Operation Compass as a topic for a war game, it is very hard to imagine a competitive game in which an Italian and a British player would be able to play a confrontational and equal game. This was such an overwhelming advantage and such an overwhelming success for the British that playing the Italian side would be boring or even unreasonable, because the outcome of this battle is well known from the beginning. So the decision to create a solitaire game covering this subject seems to be very wise. And searching for strong points of this game, I would like to comment by this. I believe that the sole idea of designing a solitaire game about this operation is a good decision. I'm glad that this is not a two-players game, because it would be very hard to create a competitive game about this operation. Having said that, what I believe are the strong points of this title? Well, first of all, I believe that the rules of this game have been very well prepared, very well written. This is the first game of Chris Harding simulations that I had the pleasure to discover, and I must say that I didn't know what to expect. There were some companies in the past which I have already reviewed the games from, which prepared the rules of the games in such an ambiguous way that this increased the difficulty of playing them. And when discovering new games, especially from the less known companies, I'm always a little bit anxious and a little bit afraid that those rule books or those products will be not sufficiently tested games or games with ambiguous rules. So I was really pleased after reading the rulebook of Operation Compass, because I had absolutely no doubts how to play the game. The rules are very well written, they are very simple, straightforward, with a very understandable language, because there are also some companies which use very professional, very complicated language structures, which are maybe very easy for native speakers, but more hard for people for whom language is not their mother tongue. So here I had absolutely no doubts. So chapeau bas, Chris Harding, because you created a game not only very pleasant to play, but also very easy to learn. This is something not achieved by every designer. Now, having said that, I also believe that what is a really strong point of this title is the fact that you receive in those pretty short rules a lot of chrome, a lot of mechanisms which nicely mend the historical outcome, the historical factors which took place in this operation with the game flow, with the game philosophy. So you receive things like terrain structures which influence gameplay, which influence your decisions by where to pass, how to spend your movement points, when to stick to the road and when to try to pass through the desert. So the terrain is an interesting one, although the map is not a big one. But in my opinion, it influences some decisions, and it also makes you think twice what path to take. The second thing are the rules governing the Italian adversary. As I said earlier, the decision to make this game a solitaire game was a good one, because this operation would be very hard to simulate in a two-players game. But the rules which are governing the Italian retreat, the Italian behavior during battles, are very easy, and at the same time they simulate very well the way that the Italians acted on the strategic level in 1940 and 1941. So this is also a proof why this game really is an interesting thing to be done in a solitaire game. You have also the rules governing the armor advantage, the armor support. Not to forget that in order to win, you have to bring armor units up to the western edge of the map in order to achieve victory. So there are some factors incorporated to this game which nicely simulate the way that the campaign went on in 1940 and 1941. What I really like in the game is also the idea to use those additional strength markers which are always drawn when entering in contact with Italian units. And this is because of two reasons. The first one is because it is a thing that augments replayability. This is not a game with a huge replayability. I will be talking about it in a few moments, but this sole factor increases it and makes you think twice whenever you enter in contact with an Italian unit. Now, the second aspect is that it also brings into the game something of a fog of war element. When playing many war games, you just see the strength of the opposing unit, and you have the comfort of calculating the strength defense ratio, the attack defense ratio, before launching the attack. Of course, there are some factors such as die rolls, modifiers, but it is much easier to plan such an attack ahead when knowing the exact strength of the defense. But in real life, in Northern Africa and everywhere else, this is not the case. You often do not know exactly what your opponent is up to, what is his exact strength. So this is also a nice way to bring into the game some fog of war elements, and each time you will enter into contact with an Italian unit, it's only at this point that you will exactly know what is its real strength. Not to mention that this mechanism also helps to bring into the game the steps elements. You have 3 steps, or it depends on the unit, which you just reduce by using this additional counter. So you don't have to use 2 counters or strength counters in order to make big stacks. You're using 1 additional counter which is flipped, removed, and then you're using the sole Italian counter. So this is a very interesting design. It's not the first time that I have seen this mechanism, because we have such a mechanism, for instance, in Salerno from Ultiman Publishing from a few years back, but it really suits well the design. So this is a nice addition. So what in my opinion are the weaker points of this title? One of them was already mentioned. I believe this is a game which will not have a big replayability factor. There are some elements which will differentiate the games you play, because you have those Italian counters which will differentiate their strength. You can set up initially in a different way your forces. You can choose different offensive paths. The Italian units will sometimes retreat, sometimes stay on their place. So there are some elements which will randomize play. But in my opinion, because of the scale, because of the small map, because of the Italians retreating from turn 4 onwards, this game will be at most times similar when played. Of course, no two games will be played in the same exact way, but you will have the same feeling while playing them. Of course, this is also related to the initial intentions, to the initial design philosophy. So this is not a minus of this game. This is just something that you should take into consideration when deciding to buy this game. The second aspect, which is something absolutely subjective, is the quality of the components. Now, I have absolutely no problem with it because I am used to playing old games. I played war games since the early 90s, and at that point, well, using scissors in order to cut out the pieces was a standard thing. Nowadays, the standard is pretty much different, is very different, because you get laser cut counters. You have rounded counters of a very, very high quality. You have extremely beautiful counters with fantastic artwork. In Operation Compass, you receive very functional counters, which you will have to cut by yourself with scissors. Now, this is not a minus. Understand what I am saying. Chris Harding Simulations is not a big company, and it cannot be compared in the standard of the quality of the elements to the big players. So it really deserves to be underlined that all those small companies which are publishing games are doing this very often in order to fulfill their dreams, in order to share their passion with the audience, and this is how the things should work. I do not believe that we should expect the absolute same standard. Is the standard of this design of those elements sufficient to play an interesting game? Absolutely yes. Is it reasonable when it comes to the price which the publisher set for this game? Also yes. So in my opinion, it's not a minus. It's a thing that you should take into consideration if you wonder if you want to have this game. You should know about it and decide knowing this thing. So again, not a minus, a thing that you should take into consideration. Concluding, Operation Compass is an interesting solitaire design about one of the most successful World War II operations. A design with very well written rules, with some nice mechanisms which represent in an intelligent way the way that the operation historically went. A game which will be using old school components, a game in which you should also take into consideration that the replay value will not be extremely high. But even so, this is a game worth trying, a game in which you can try yourself and you can recreate this historical campaign. This was a review of Operation Compass from Chris Harding Simulations. I invite you to look at our other videos. We have some reviews, we have some unboxings. Take also a look at our Instagram account. Have a nice day and see you next time.